You mentioned that in the book where disobedience of children, is that linked to that? I mean, how have you linked it and how have you interpreted that to some of the signs that we see today where children are disobedient towards the parents, where we see the parents fear their children? Now, that hierarchy, that level of respect, and the way the role reversal that we see in certain parts of the world.
So what happens in today's day and age is that young children will treat their parents like slaves. That is an interpretation given by some. But if you look at these two signs, in the hadith of Jibreel, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam pinpoints mainly these two signs. What is clear from the hadith that each sign is indicative of two major shifts in society, and these shifts did occur. They occurred post Caliphate 1924, but pre abolition of the Caliphate in the 1800s, when you had the Tanzimat movement in the 1800s, and also the Industrial Revolution. So I covered that also.
You did, yes.
That there is a hadith with regard to when the generally the scale of society was what, that the people of the city were in need of the people of the country, because the people of the country, they would carry out farming, and that farming would benefit the people of the city. But one of the shifts that occurs in the end of times is where the people of the countryside shift to the cities. So urbanization, something that we observe now with globalization, urbanization is something that had a major impact on the world, especially post-industrial revolution. So the industrial revolution initially occurring in Britain, but then the replicas occurred across Europe and across the world, to the point that China and India today replicate that at the cost of the environment.
But you see, it's interesting that you mentioned that. But here in Britain, we find that the farmers were given a subsidy. This is something that I wanted to cover, by the Europeans, not to grow crops. They were given huge subsidies, huge sums of money to leave their fields empty of crops.
The reason for that is, like the UN sometimes has forces nations to only grow certain specific things in order that they can import other produce from other nations. So Egypt or Sudan being forced to only grow cotton, so the British could make cheap uniforms in the late 1800s. But when that country is struck or stricken with a famine, then they are unable to have wheat and barley because they rely on imports. So this happens through trade agreements across nations. So British farmers being forced to do that is through trade agreements with the EU. Similarly, this expectation of farmers today to have a ban on farmers having rearing beef, meaning having cows, because they claim the cows are damaging the environment. This is a false claim, because the type of cow farming that is damaging the environment is the type that is done in South America, where the South American rainforest is cut down to make farming land. That actually damages the rainforest. But why are they doing that in South America? To pay off debt. Who are they paying debt off to? The IMF and the World Bank, which increases the Riba, which also relates to Ashratu Sa'a, where in the hadith in the Sunan of Imam Abu Dawood, the Prophet ﷺ says, a time will come on the world where people will consume riba, and the one who does not consume riba, he will be afflicted by its dust. That time, alongside with the Bedouins competing in the construction of tall buildings, has had its global impact, meaning interest-based banking. So even the farming is affected by a riba, to the point that this policy of abolishing cow rearing in order to save the environment, these are policies that need to be double checked, meaning it's a policy that's based on a false premise in the first place.
Interesting, very interesting. You mentioned that the Dajjal system, the Dajjalic tribulations, and the Dajjalic times. How do you differentiate between the three of them? So you've got the system that's probably, which some of the signs that you're discussing that we're talking about now, part of that. The tribulations and the times of the Dajjalic time. How have you differentiated between the three, and what are the main differences of all three?
So my methodology is primarily based on the Quran and Sunnah. It's not based upon conspiracy theory. As you know, 1/3 of the book is in refutation of conspiracy theorists
Yeah.
who misconstrue a hadith, misinterpret a hadith. The hadith mentions that no fitna occurs except it is in preparation for a Dajjal. I think the reference is in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And by the way, most of the hadith in the work have been referenced to their primary sources, most of them, overwhelmingly. And the overwhelming majority of the hadiths are actually authentic, the overwhelming majority of the hadith.
Yeah.
There are a few that some people can give some criticism with regard to the chain of narration, but they have been cited by scholars of the science. So that hadith informs us that any tribulation that occurs actually weakens the iman. So that weakening of iman is preparation for a Dajjal. Anything that weakens your iman is a fitna of a Dajjal. Secondly, any system, any power system can be described as being a Dajjalic. So currently speaking, we have a globalist capitalist system. This capitalist system can be described as a Dajjalic in so many aspects, like the propaganda blitz that is on the minds of people so many times, false news, or the spread of false news within a short period of time.
You mentioned the internet, and you mentioned all these other things that are being used currently to spread false information.
Corporate media, for instance.
Corporate media.
In order to tarnish or meaning tarnish the enemy or to undermine the enemy, this is done on the regular. And that's mentioned in hadith in the end of times, that the shayateen will spread in order to spread false news, especially with regard to the sunnah, to harm the sunnah, meaning to misinform people with regard to the sunnah.
Do you mention, when you mention this, is it within the Muslims, or do you think majority of it is those people who are not Muslim and to try to damage the image of Islam around the world, or do you think we're suffering that within ourselves also?
So because we have a globalization, again, we have a global village, the nature of the world has changed from the fiqh books of from a few hundred years ago, where they would mention the division of Darul Islam and Darul Harb. That division is more nuanced today in terms of we have a nation state model. That nation state model is the post-colonial age. They say it's decolonization, but in fact it's not decolonization, because those nations are actually plugged within the IMF and the World Bank and the UN. These constructs are made institutions, post-World War II and post-World War I institutions that have been constructed by the power structure in order to keep people in a state of subservience to the global order that we have. It can be described as a Dajjalic. Similarly, communism, when it was on the rise, post-Bolshevik revolution in 1917, communism was Dajjalic without doubt. So even if capitalism falls and it's replaced by something else, the Dajjalic nature of a power system can be described as a Dajjalic system. This will continue until a Dajjal, the individual, appears. So currently, when we describe the Dajjalic system, you have the proliferation of Riba, exploitation of people through the banking system. You have a proliferation of propaganda blitz, certain media corporations. They have false news. They will not mention certain things that are occurring in the world in order to frame a war, to validate war. You have the industrial military complex of the world, meaning countries are made to join NATO in order that arms manufacturers can then sell those weapons to those nations.
Have a controlled system.
An entire system,
Yeah.
a globalized system. You have nations, Muslim nations, that have an army which is actually selling and manufacturing and selling arms to the enemies of Muslims. So where weapons are exported from Muslim countries to Ukraine in order to give Ukraine bullets, but those same countries will not export armaments to Muslim nations that are in need in order to fight colonization. So all of this is Dajjalic in nature. But it relates to the hadith the Prophet ﷺ said, two groups of people I have not seen from lam arahuma, meaning sinfani min ahli nar, lam arahuma, two groups of people from the people of hellfire, I have not seen them. One of them was what? A group of people who leave the house in the morning under the wrath of Allah, and what do? They torture people.
Allah.
So, and when they return back under the wrath, anger of Allah. This torturing of the populations is also something that occurs in the modern age, where the power system does not actually fear the population, because governments have been armed to the teeth, meaning the arms military complex is armed to the teeth to the point that they do not fear the population.
So when you mention torturing of the people, now it's not actual physical torture per se.
No, I
It
mean
could be
physical torture.
Physical torture.
Physical,
Emotional torture,
physical
financial torture.
There is also psyops. You have psyop operations on the population. You have torture of the people where you have black operations. You have black sites where the secret services of any nation, they could take people to a black site, torture them. But there is also mental torture, psychological torture.
Financial torture.
Financial torture is through the banking system.
Banking system, yeah.
The riba, meaning people are enslaved to everyone is worried about paying off their mortgages, which is a scam system in itself, meaning house prices.
As we're on the topic of mortgages, I mean, you mentioned mortgages, and I know you've spoken about mortgages in your speeches. What's the real opinion? Now, some ulama have given a fatwa that, yes, it's allowed. One mortgage is allowed, one house is allowed because you need to stay. I mean, I just
some of
to
them have given
that.
Some of them have given a fatwa that buying as many properties as you want, this is promoting capitalism within the Muslims. So what happens? You have a Muslim tycoon who will buy multiple properties, and then what will he do? He will charge tenants extortionate amounts for their rent. This is not the way a Muslim should be, meaning pure capitalism. Migrants who come to the UK or to other countries, a Muslim landlord charging them extortionate rent, mistreating them. So this fatwa is a misguided fatwa. Riba is haram by ijma'. By ijma', it's qat'i in the Quran, meaning riba is haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited riba. So some people say, they quote a passage from the Hanafi books, La riba bayna harbiyin wa muslimin fi dar al-harb. Now, this passage is mentioned in the Hanafi fiqh books, is referring to an active harbi. So these people then say England is Darul Harb, but they enter through a visa and passports, which is entails that we are musta'min, we are entering with what? With security.
Yeah.
So how can you frame England or these countries that we live in terms of there's no active warfare? Because these books were written hundreds of years ago in a different world context. That world context was where you had a khilafah, there was Darul Khilafah, and anything out of the Darul Khilafah was Darul Harb. But it entailed active warfare, because the Darul Khilafah was in active warfare with some of the Durul Harb, some of the countries that were places of war. So there are settler colonial entities, for instance, in the Middle East, where there is active warfare currently. So if a Muslim went there, in the Hanafi school, he finds one of these occupying forces soldiers. Not even a soldier, even a settler, who is settled within the illegal entity, that illegal entity.
Yeah.
This is the Hanafi fatwa. You give him $10 and you say, pay me $100. That's permitted. So that's the actual fatwa. Secondly, some people, they quote Sarakhsi's al-Mabsut. In Sarakhsi's al-Mabsut, he mentions that if you go to Darul Harb, you give 2 gold coins, you give away 2 gold coins in exchange for 1 gold coin. They say, look, this shows that you are allowed to give riba, pay riba, in order to receive a house. They quote this passage from Sarakhsi's al-Mabsut. The response to that is, if they had any knowledge with regard to currency, they would know that passage is referring to devalued gold coin, that you give 2 devalued gold coins to an active harbi, and you attain the pure gold coin, you are benefiting by taking that. In reference to active Ahlul Harb, like the Hanafi fatwas that mention the selling of alcohol in Darul Harb. Those fatwas are referring to, for instance, if you were in the illegal occupying entity that we have today in the Middle East, and to one of those active harbis, you actually sold some commodities and you made money from them, which is benefiting you and harming them because alcohol was seen as something harming them, that would be permitted. It's not referring to entering a country where you are living with a visa or a passport and you actively then sell alcohol. Na'udhu billah. That's a misguided interpretation. Now, these people are very strict on the size of people's beards, but very lenient on a riba or photography and video. But they are lenient on riba, which makes no sense because a riba is something clearly prohibited in the Quran and Sunnah. So
those people who say that you're allowed and you are entitled to one property on riba, on a mortgage,
that's based on a different reasoning. So that's based upon a darura or al-haja. Is there an actual darura? Well, if you have a council house, there is no darura. If you have land and property in Pakistan or another country, Bangladesh or wherever you come from originally, then there is no darura. So the darura is case specific. Darura would be Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, rahimahullah, the most foremost hadith scholar of recent times and Hanafi jurist. He said darura here would be that if you were forced to live in a tent outside on the road. In this day and age, they have these homes, shelters. If you end up in a shelter and you need a home, then of course, and the darura is according to the size of the house also. So how can you have a palace that you pay through riba and then refer to that as a darura? That is not a darura, meaning a man has a palace, he pays through riba. So this proliferation of riba is one of the ashratu sa'a, which is undermined. In fact, I went to Malawi. When I went to Malawi, they asked me about riba, and I said it's haram. And the chairman of the masjid commended me. He said, we have so many ulama coming from these various other countries. They've never told the Indian community that lives in Malawi that taking bank loans with interest is haram. They've never informed them of that.
So not only does it apply to homes, but it applies to cars on lease and on finance, on all of this. I mean, as you mentioned, and rightly so, when you say that they are being tortured. Now, this is one of the forms of torture, that they are cornering you into a system, the Dajjalic system, as you mentioned rightly so in the book, and you've covered it today in the topic also, that people are being coerced into a corner of riba, of financial burden that's not, as you mentioned, darura. It's not a necessity, but it's because they want to be a part of that system, or they feel that they need to be a part of that system. They're being forced into it.
So the Quran states, الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَى, those who consume riba, لَا يَقُومُونَ, they do not stand up, إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي, except like the one who stands, يَتَخَبَّطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ, the one who is touched by shaitan. You go to the London Underground, you see how people 9 to 5, how their minds are affected in order just to pay off mortgages. These muftis who give this fatwa, they do not realize how damaging riba is. In England, how many homes are repossessed because people are unable to keep up with their payments?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thousands of homes are repossessed, so people lose their homes. They pay tens and thousands of pounds as payments, and then they are unable to keep up the payments because they lose their jobs because of extraneous factors like COVID-19 or other factors due to which they lose their job, and they lose their payments, they lose their homes. So this fatwa actually damages people. It harms them in the long run. They lose money. They may think that Muslims are benefiting because many of us have support systems, meaning within our families, but not everyone has this anymore. There are many Muslims who do not have a support system, and non-Muslims who are harmed by a riba. A riba harms Muslims and non-Muslims.